She woke up in silk, soaked with the smell of blood. The first moan was heard in the east wing, between the third and fourth strokes of the night watch. The palace guards did not record it. At that time, no one was allowed into the private chambers of the Countess of Saint-Martin. 2 days earlier, she had dismissed her maids, refused her usual treatments, and ordered the door to be locked from the inside. People said she had a fever. People said she was praying for forgiveness. No one knew for sure, but one thing was clear to everyone. The body of the kingdom, as she had been called in all the chronicles for more than 20 years, was beginning to die. The servants who were allowed to clean the east wing later reported to the council. It smelled strange, like rotting fabric in a church after winter. The windows did not open, the shutters were tightly closed, and the room where mirrors had once hung was now covered with coarse wool. It was the beginning of the end. According to a report from the apothecary Clement, on the 14th day of the month of St. Agatha, she asked for hot water, pushed away a glass of broth, and for the first time in many years cried out, "Don't you dare touch me, I'm rotting." Until then, no one had seen how she was suffering. She used to appear in scarlet, with bare shoulders and thin arms that were called the greatest gift of France. Now she had shadows under her eyes, smelled of iron, and a thick liquid appeared on her sheets. The first signs of the disease appeared in the fall: weakness, convulsions, and pain in the lower abdomen. The doctors spoke of a female ailment. The council insisted that her favorite, the Marquis de Landry, be removed from her chambers to avoid gossip. At that time, no one uttered the word cancer. It was replaced by expressions such as internal decay or blood poisoning. Rumors of venereal disgrace spread faster than official reports. Her servants remained silent. Some disappeared. By order of the Queen Mother, opium in infusions, wine, and ointments with marmot fat began to be sent to her chambers. A priest was brought in. He was allowed in once. He came out without saying a word, and did not return. His letter to the Bishop of Rouen contained only one line: "If her flesh is still alive, it is not God's mercy, but a curse." Silence reigned in the palace. The courtiers avoided the east wing. Food was no longer brought there. Servants left bowls on the windowsill. Sometimes, according to reports, they remained untouched. The official report of the Countess's attending physician, signed by Dr. Etienne Savard, has been preserved in the archives of Troyes. The condition is worsening. A foul-smelling discharge from the vagina has been noted, soaking her undergarments and sheets. Her skin is pale and covered with spots, and her temperature remains at 40 degrees. She is experiencing pain in her lower back, swelling in her groin, loss of appetite, and irritability. On the third day, according to a maid named Eloise, when changing the linen, the skin on the inner thigh remained on the fabric. Eloise fainted and did not approach her again. After that, the Countess's body was not touched. The sheets were simply replaced, with new ones slipped under the old ones. No one heard her voice. When the smell spread beyond the wing, the royal council ordered censers to be brought, and juniper to be burned. The stench did not disappear. According to the captain of the guard, one of the gatekeepers, passing by the room, lost consciousness and hit his head on the railing. He died that same night. Meanwhile, letters from the provinces reported that the nobility was dissatisfied with the silence of the royal court. Rumors reached the Bishop of Lyon, who remarked in private, "If she who was called the body of the nation dies in filth and fear, then God has turned his face away from France." On the 7th day, the Countess opened her eyes. This was confirmed by the apothecary, who had been summoned by the king's mother. He entered, saw her lying with her mouth half open, and, in his words, her eyes were looking, but not seeing, as if she saw not us, but someone behind us. He brought a damp cloth to her forehead. In response, she let out a groan, deep, as if from her stomach. The cloth turned black. That same night, Dr. Savard made a single handwritten note, marking it personal. It was kept in a box with a wax seal. It read, The groin area has turned black. When touched, there is discharge with pus. Temperature cannot be measured. The body is hot to the touch. Pulse is weak. The skin on the abdomen is peeling. The mammary glands are swollen and the skin is cracked. There is a yellowish discharge with a putrid odor. This was not reported to any member of the council. By the 10th day, the wing was sealed off. Only 2 servants were allowed access, and they were ordered not to speak. One of them disappeared. The other later wrote, "She talks to someone at night. She whispers. Sometimes she laughs. Sometimes she calls the dead." These statements were only added to the case file half a century later. When the Archbishop entered the room, he covered his face with his sleeve. He did not come close, but after leaving, he said that the body was no longer of this world. He did not bless her, nor did he leave a prayer. The first signs of internal decay were obvious: the smell, the pus, the stains on the floor. But the most frightening sign appeared later. Blood began to seep through her shirt, not in one place, everywhere, through her chest, through her thighs, even from her neck. They called her silk, but now the silk had darkened, become heavy, and smelled of damp earth. Those around her said she was dying, not as a woman, but as a curse. By the morning of the 5th day, the entire southern wing of the palace was closed off. Guards stood at the silk screens covering the entrance, not even allowing the cook to bring her broth. Inside, behind the thick curtains, it no longer smelled of pain, but of decay. The blood had stopped flowing. Now, a yellow liquid pooled in the hollows between the folds of her body, and the silk of her nightgown, which had once caressed her thighs, clung to her skin, leaving clay-colored stains. The Countess did not utter a word. A dry rattle, like the scraping of stone on glass, sometimes came from her throat. The court physician, Clement, recorded it thus: "Her throat seems to be rubbing itself from the inside." On the 6th day, a cough appeared. The first spit was pink, then bloody threads stretched from her mouth down to her chin. The servants refused to touch the sheets. One of the women said she saw something white moving in the fold between the Countess's legs. She was dismissed, but the smell from the chambers did not go away. On the 7th day, a second doctor was called to the chambers, an old surgeon named Honoré Duval. He arrived with 2 apprentices and refused to enter until the bishop arrived. According to him, a woman's flesh, if defiled, should not be examined without the permission of the church. But they had to wait until evening. The bishop arrived after prayers, burned incense, and allowed the body to be examined without interference. The examination began at sunset. Servants held lamps at arm's length, trying not to breathe. The Countess did not move. She lay in the same position as when she was found 3 days earlier, her arms along her body, her legs drawn up, her face silent. When the doctors lifted the lower edge of the sheet, everyone froze. There was no longer any pink skin in the groin area. There was a dark, almost gray surface, covered with ulcers and blisters. When they tried to gently wash the area with lavender infusion, the skin burst. Honoré's report stated, between the thighs, tissue with signs of internal decay was observed. The left lymph node is enlarged to the size of a walnut. A viscous yellow liquid with a putrid odor is oozing from the scratch. Muscle tissue separates with a light touch. All this was read aloud behind closed doors in the presence of the herald and the confessor. The latter said, "The Lord is testing her body to reveal her soul." No one responded. By the morning of the 8th day, the Countess's hair began to fall out. It remained on the pillow, tangled in wet clumps. The skin on her head turned red, then became covered with small scales, like those of a fish. When the lady-in-waiting tried to comb her hair, the comb went into the flesh at her temple. The girl screamed and fainted. She was taken away and not allowed back in. Clement suggested cauterizing the inflamed areas with a hot iron, but the Countess's mother refused. She ordered her daughter's body to be wrapped in wine bandages and the room to be fumigated every hour. but it didn't help. On the contrary, after each fumigation, black insects began to crawl along the walls. "They are attracted by the smell," said one of the servants. He was later found strangled in the laundry room. On the 9th day, a white-gray mass began to ooze from the Countess's nipples. The servant who cleaned the soiled bandages said he saw a worm in it. He could no longer sleep and asked for a separate room far from the chambers. 2 days later, he disappeared. The 10th day passed in silence. The Countess did not move, but at noon, her mouth opened again. She did not speak. A sound like moan escaped from her larynx, and she began to vomit. The vomit contained no food, only blood, mucus, and something thick and curled up like liver. The doctor wrote, "Probably a detachment of stomach tissue." He did not dare to open the body. It was still breathing, but the breathing was different, sometimes faint, sometimes deep and guttural. Her mouth smelled like a corpse. One of the guards who had been watching over the chambers later reported that he had heard whispering during the night. It sounded as if someone was praying in the corner and then crying, but there was no one in the room. On the 11th day, the bishop refused to enter. He sent a note, "I smell death, but I see no soul." His words were discussed all night. In the end, it was decided to call Abbot Pierre, the same one who had refused to bury heretics. He entered the next morning, stayed by the bed for half an hour, then left, closed the door behind him and said, "Her body no longer belongs to her, nor does it belong to us." By the 12th day, the smell had spread beyond the south wing. The cleaning ladies began to complain of headaches, and the cook who brought food to the neighboring chambers lost consciousness. The Countess's body no longer responded to touch. When they tried to change the sheets, one of the maids screamed. Between her shoulder blades, the skin had stuck to the fabric and remained on it like burnt parchment. From then on, they stopped changing the sheets. Instead, bags of tansy and sandalwood were hung over the body, and a basin of vinegar and salt crystals was placed under the bed. The servants spoke of monsters. One of them claimed to have seen whitish larvae crawling over the body. He was taken out of the palace at dawn. The next morning, he died of suffocation in his home. The official cause of death was given as a heart attack. However, a report sent to the Duke of Narbonne by Chancellor Etienne contained the following: "Death occurred within 6 hours of entering the infected chambers. Traces of gray mucus were found in his lungs." This letter was removed from the archives a year later. The Countess's skin changed color. Her stomach turned black like a burnt candle. Her chest was covered with raised ulcers, and a palm-sized abscess opened on the inside of her thigh. Clément and Honoré swore not to open the body until her death, but they knew that the decay had begun while she was still alive. They smeared the affected areas with a salve made of turpentine, clay, and honey. It was useless. The next day, a lymph node the size of a fist swelled up on the Countess's shoulder. It burst under the bandage, leaving a bloody stain on the wall behind the headboard. On the 13th day, the door to the gallery broke. The lock was rusted through. When they tried to fix it, a beetle crawled out of the crack. The priest, standing nearby, recoiled and said, "It's a sign." He was ordered to keep quiet. That same evening, one of the nuns sent to keep watch at night reported that she had heard breathing but saw no body. She disappeared, taking neither candles nor keys with her. 2 days later, she was found in the sacristy, hanged, her fingers charred. A piece of paper was found with her. She didn't leave, she stayed inside. The 14th day was a turning point. Blood began to flow again, this time from her ears. The Countess's face was swollen, her nostrils were dilated, and her tongue was swollen and cracked. Dr. Honoré noted, "Breathing is maintained, but the putrid odor has increased. The skin is disintegrating. When touched, the finger sinks into the flesh. The abdomen is like that of a corpse." But she was alive. She was breathing, hoarsely, sharply, with rumbling sound. A servant named Jules, who had been posted at the door, later said that he saw a liquid slowly dripping onto the bedspread, dark, oily, with clots. It soaked through the fabric and reached the wooden floor. Steam began to rise from the floor. It burned him. The splints had to be removed. When the carpenters opened the boards, they found slime and white worms underneath. The 15th day was the most terrible. A former surgeon and embalmer from Rouen, invited by the Duchess, entered the chamber. He did not touch the body. He only said, "This is not death. This is rejection." His words were recorded in the chronicles of the convent of St. Clare. In the evening of the same day, an attempt was made to sprinkle the countess with holy water. The liquid fell on her chest and immediately darkened. There was a smell of burning. One of the novices was blinded. The skin on her stomach swelled up. The servant who changed the bandage saw a movement beneath it, not breathing, but as if something inside was pushing out. Something viscous, gray-yellow in color with black specks, flowed out of the tear. Clement refused to describe it. He only wrote, "Contents incompatible with life." On the 16th day, the Countess's mother tried to enter. She was not allowed in. She stood at the door, leaning her forehead against the doorframe, and said, "If she is still there, let her know that I have forgiven her." There was no response. Late in the evening, the body began to moan. Not to speak, but to moan, long and hoarsely, as if the air were being forced out from deep within. Everyone heard it. A servant fainted. The abbot began to read prayers. One of the nuns fled through the back door. The next morning, the ribbon on the door was blackened and crumbling. All the fabrics in the room had darkened. The rooms began to be covered with iron plates to keep the smell out. On the 17th day after the first bleeding, no one remained in the rooms except for one monk from the Order of the Silent Ones. His name was Benoit. He was mute, and that is why he was chosen by those who had not yet fled. He was sent to sit by the door and signal if anything changed. A bell was hung on his belt. When he rang it on the 18th day, 2 men in masks entered the chambers. One of them later wrote, "We found her on her side. Everything beneath her was black. She was breathing, but her skin was like dried wax. The blood flowed again, this time through her navel. Something like rotten tar oozed from it. Blistering sores formed around her navel, from which maggots protruded. On the 19th day, the bone on her leg was exposed. The skin had simply peeled away. The bones began to turn yellow and crack. One of the doctors, seeing her in this condition for the first time, refused to enter a second time. He said, 'This is not a human being. This is a vessel for punishment.' A dispute broke out in the palace council. Some insisted on amputating her limbs to stop the decay. Others suggested burning the body while it was still breathing as a sacrifice for the sins of the family. But the Duchess forbade it. She ordered, 'If she dies, it will be only as a daughter of the house, without flames, without cries.' These words were recorded in the report of the notary Emile. 2 days later, he disappeared. On the 20th day, the room was dark, even during the day. The windows were boarded up. The walls were covered with rags soaked in vinegar. Bowls of salt and copper stood on the floor. The Countess was no longer moving. Only her eyes, cloudy and almost white, sometimes blinked. When one of the nuns leaned over her, she heard a hoarse whisper, 'They're all inside.' She said no more. At night, the room became damp. Condensation appeared in the corners. The ceiling began to drip. The candles would not light. The wicks went out immediately. Those who remained began to record the last symptoms. In Clement's report, between her legs is an ulcer, from which a colorless liquid with the smell of death flows. When touched, there is a pulsation. There is no body temperature, but steam is coming from the wounds. On the 22nd day, something slimy came out of the Countess's ears. A servant said, 'She can no longer hear,' but her face still expressed pain. Late in the evening, the skin on her stomach burst. The doctor looked into the wound and immediately recoiled. He said that there is not a single intact organ inside. Everything has turned to jelly. This was recorded in the monastery's internal act, but later redacted. On the 24th day, one of the senior monks, Frederick, demanded that the body be opened and the suffering ended. He was dismissed. He disappeared that same night. In the morning, maggots were found under his bed. On the 26th day, new secretions began. They seeped through the bed covers, soaked the straw, and left oily traces. The monks who buried the deceased said that even the dead were easier to carry away. The Countess's flesh began to crumble, not rot, but literally fall apart like flour. Her hair fell out in clumps. Her skin cracked like burnt parchment, but she was still breathing, barely audible, almost inhuman. On the 31st day, pus began to flow from her chest. Her body temperature was around 30 degrees. A servant described it. Her nipples have turned black. There is a smell of sour milk and dead flesh. There is a hole under her chest. This report was destroyed, but it remained in a letter sent to the Abbey of St. Vitus. It said, "She is decomposing, but she is not dying." On the same day, a secret commission was convened. It consisted of 2 priests, a silent brother, 3 doctors, and a notary. They conducted an examination. None of them survived until morning. One died of fever. The second went blind. The third threw himself out of the window. The notes they made were burned. All that remained was a scrap of paper with the words, "There is someone in there. She is not alone." On the 38th day, she was buried, officially, without a body. Bags of salt, stones, and pieces of cloth were placed in the coffin. The coffin was sealed with 7 seals. The funeral service was held at a distance. No priest came closer than 3 fathoms. A rumor spread through the palace. The body did not yield to the earth. It remained in the chambers. This was later confirmed. One of the servants, cleaning up the remains of straw, found footprints on the floor. They were covered in slime. He died a day later. A month later, a decree was issued. Close the south wing, move the inhabitants, remove the posts. The room was bricked up. The architect's diary reads, "The stone wept. We put plaster on it, but it rotted. We installed doors, but they rotted." A year later, a chapel was built on the site. 2 months later, it burned down, supposedly from lightning. Only one line remained in the monastery chronicles. "She was the body of the kingdom, but the flesh betrayed the soul, and the kingdom turned away." This line was banned. 7 years later, a girl born on the day of her death died in the same bed.